Welcome back, everyone, to another explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of statutory legislation, Chapter 6, specifically Sections 61 through 66 of the Factory Act of 1948. You know, if you've ever wondered exactly how the law manages to balance the relentless, grinding demands of industrial production with the actual physical limitations of the human beings doing the work, well, this is where we find out. Let's dive in and demystify this dense legal phrasing together so we can really understand the exact statutory rights and operational boundaries placed on adult working hours in factories.
Okay, let's jump right into this. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. Number 1, notices and worker registers. Number 2, the power to make exempting rules. Number 3, handling exceptional press of work. And finally, number 4, restrictions on women's employment. Starting right off with Section 1, notices and worker registers, which creates the baseline of transparency.
So before any exceptions can be made or any overtime approved, the state basically says, look, we need a perfect, unshakable baseline of operational transparency. Because, let's face it, you simply can't regulate what you can't see. To achieve this, the law demands 2 distinct, parallel records that have to be maintained at all times. On one side, Section 61 requires a public notice of periods of work. And on the other, Section 62 demands a register of adult workers. Think of it this way. One is a highly visible public declaration on the wall, and the other is a meticulous, constantly updated individual ledger.
Let's look a little closer at Section 61. This notice of periods is literally required to be displayed right there on the wall. It has to show clearly for every single day the exact periods during which adult workers might be required to work. And the absolute genius of this rule? It completely prevents unpredictable on-the-fly scheduling. It essentially forces factory managers to classify their workers into distinct groups and fix their shifts, or relays, entirely beforehand. If a manager suddenly wants to change the system of work, no way. They can't just do it. They have to formally notify the inspector in duplicate beforehand and generally sit tight for a full week before that change can actually take effect.
Now, while that notice is public, the Section 62 register is deeply personal. The manager must maintain this register, and it has to be available to the inspector at any given moment during working hours. It specifically requires 4 steps of documentation: the name of each adult worker, the exact nature of their work, their group assignment, and their allotted shift relay. Absolutely no adult is allowed to do a single minute of work in that factory unless these specific details are officially entered into the register.
So, the crucial point is captured right here in Section 63. This section acts as the ultimate enforcement tool, basically tying those previous 2 sections together. It explicitly bans any off-the-books shadow shifts. If a worker's hours don't perfectly match both that public notice on the wall and their personal entry in the register, it's a direct violation of the law. There is zero ambiguity here, folks.
Moving right along to Section 2, power to make exempting rules, or how the law adapts to actual factory realities.
Because, as we all know, factories aren't perfect, isolated machines, right? They exist in the messy, real world. Which brings up an incredibly important question. What exactly happens when reality hits this strict rulebook? Say a vital piece of machinery suddenly breaks down, or a massive crop of seasonal raw material just arrives and needs immediate processing. Well, this is exactly where we pivot from the rule to the exceptions found in Section 64.
Under Section 64, the state government is granted the power to make exempting rules for some highly specific, practical scenarios. Just look at the sheer variety here. We're talking about workers engaged in urgent repairs, those doing preparatory work outside normal hours, or managing continuous technical processes that literally cannot be stopped once they've started. The exemptions cover the daily supply of prime necessities, seasonal manufacturing rushes, and even schedules dependent on unpredictable natural forces. They also carve out special allowances for engine room attendants, newspaper printing breakdowns, and the heavy loading of railway wagons. In these very specific circumstances, the standard daily and weekly hour limits can, legally, be bent.
But bending the rules absolutely doesn't mean breaking them entirely. The law places a very strict cap on the amount of overtime a worker can do under these Section 64 exemptions, and it uses a specific legal metric to measure it: the quarter. Legally defined, a quarter is a period of 3 consecutive months, starting on the 1st of January, April, July, or October. Keep this definition tucked away in your mind because it acts as the absolute ceiling for worker flexibility.
Which brings us to Section 3,
handling exceptional press of work, where we really test the limits of this flexibility.
Now, if Section 64 is all about predictable seasonal work, Section 65 is for the unexpected. It allows the state government or the chief inspector to issue special, written orders to directly exempt a factory from the standard rules. This is a highly situational power. It's granted specifically to deal with sudden, massive demands on a factory's output, what the legal text dramatically calls an exceptional press of work. This leads us right to the climax of these regulations. If the government can literally issue written orders to bypass standard hour restrictions because of intense operational pressure, you've got to ask, just how far can these rules actually be stretched before the law finally steps in and says enough?
Now, what's really interesting about this is comparing the general rules of Section 64 directly with the emergency orders of Section 65. Under Section 64, daily max hours cap at 10, but during an exceptional press of work under Section 65, that stretches out to 12 hours. The spread over, which includes rest intervals, jumps from 12 up to 13 hours a day. The maximum overtime allowed per quarter, that surges from 50 hours up to 75 hours. But look closely at that weekly max row. Even under the absolute most extreme government-ordered exemptions, both sections fiercely hold the line at a 60-hour workweek. That boundary simply does not move.
Furthermore, the law builds in a mandatory circuit breaker to prevent total worker burnout. Section 65 explicitly states that even during this crazy, exceptional press of work, no workers shall be allowed to work overtime for more than 7 days at a stretch. The factory itself might be completely overwhelmed, but human biology has limits, and the law steps in right here to enforce a hard pause.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds into the restrictions on women's employment, which is basically the unbending line.
If you thought that 60-hour weekly cap was strict, Section 66 bluntly shows us where operational flexibility entirely stops and highly specific, unbending protective legislation begins. It lays down restrictions specifically regarding the employment of women. It dictates that absolutely no exemption from the daily hour limits can be granted in respect of any woman, period. Furthermore, standard employment for women is strictly restricted to the daytime hours between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m.
Now, the state government can publish a notification to vary those daytime limits slightly for certain classes of factories. However, there is a hard, completely non-negotiable boundary, 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. The law explicitly states that no variation whatsoever shall authorize the employment of any woman during this specific nighttime window. It is an absolute, ironclad ban.
And this brilliantly illustrates the true intent of the law. Section 66 mandates that shifts for women can only be changed after a weekly holiday or another official holiday. The law clearly, deeply values stable, predictable schedules. Now, there is one bizarrely specific exception to these women's employment restrictions: fish curing or fish canning factories. The state can actually grant temporary exemptions, lasting no more than 3 years at a time, but only if extending those hours is absolutely necessary to prevent the immediate damage or deterioration of the raw material. It's wild, but the law literally only yields here to prevent catastrophic biological waste.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We've traced the whole journey here, from rigid public schedules, to practical seasonal exemptions, to massive emergency overtime orders, and finally, to unyielding protective boundaries. Looking at Section 61 through 66, we really have to ask ourselves, ultimately, how does this legal framework successfully balance the urgent mechanical demands of industry with the undeniable human limits of the workforce? It's a delicate, incredibly complex tightrope walk of rules and exceptions that quite literally shapes the modern industrial world. Thanks so much for unpacking this with me today, and keep questioning the legal frameworks around you.